gun violence isn't just a statistic, it actually impacts real people. It's completely changed my whole life, and I don't want it to have to change anyone else's. My name is Zoe. I'm 20 years old. I'm from Parkland, Florida. I go to Brown University, and I'm concentrating in medical anthropology. I spent the first 9 years of my life living in the suburbs right outside Philly with my mom, my dad, my sister, who's like 2 years younger than me. And then at 9, we moved to Parkland in Florida. And yeah, I've been there ever since. I'd say I had turned 12 recently, and I was, okay, this is like a little complicated to explain, but basically the middle school that feeds into the high school Douglas where the shooting occurred, they're both next to each other and they're separated by a football field. So that's kind of like the distance I was to the school, and I was outside working on a multimedia project with a few of my friends. And this was like a very big elective class, so there were a lot of students. There's probably 40-something kids in this class. We were outside, and I remember hearing a few pops, and this is kind of ironic, I was in therapy for a fear of school shootings. Like I had anxiety as a kid, and it was like weather and like lockdown drills. So I was kind of already very like on edge about that stuff, and so I was like, was that a gunshot? And I would say Parkland, like the type of kids who, a lot of kids like moved from up north and then came to Parkland, and not a lot of us really ever had experience with guns. And so I'd never heard a gun. I'd heard BB guns before at camp, but like never like a actual like gun. And my friends were kind of just laughed it off because they're used to me being anxious, and they were like, just calm down, Zoe. Little did we know at the same time the school was going on lockdown. We were still doing our stuff, and then I saw a bunch of like first responders going down the road, and Parkland's around the Everglades, and so the first thought I had was like maybe there was a brush fire, that like there were people like near there and they got hurt. And so I like texted my mom. I was like, does something happen at Douglas or like nearby? And she called the school, and they told her to just hang up and watch the news. So they she called the middle school, the line was like busy signal, which was really weird. Then she called the non-emergency police line, and that's what they told her. And at the same time, we then heard more pops, and then we heard someone scream. And it wasn't like a victim, it was someone who was running. A lot of people jumped the gate to my middle school because there's a shopping center that was next to the middle school, and that's where everyone went for reunification. And so there were kids running through the field, like past my middle school and then to that shopping center. And so that's what we heard. And then we obviously knew something was wrong. And so we ran to the classroom door, and it was covered with like the lockdown like paper. And so then I started freaking out, and I like screamed into the middle of this big courtyard, which in retrospect probably scared a lot of people, my bad. But the security guard found us. It was probably me and like 4 or 5 other girls. And we got pushed into like the main office where like all the administration was. Everyone was just panicking. No one knew what was going on. We didn't know if the shooter was going to come here because it did end up being a former student. And so that went to Westglades, the middle school I was at, so we weren't sure what was going on. And little did I know, by the time we actually got inside the building, the shooting was already over. What we heard is what I think was the shooter trying to shoot out the windows, which was after he had already shot people, and he couldn't because they were hurricane windows, so I think that's what we heard. So I think by the time we got inside, everything was already done already. And then we were just in lockdown for a while. I think I got home at the shooting happened at 2:30. I think I got home at 8:30. And I remember when we got moved off of a code red and we went to a code yellow, which is you can move around in the room you're in, but you can't leave it. There was a bunch of other kids that got pushed into the office, and we were looking on our phones, and people were posting videos from the classrooms where kids got shot. And there was just videos of very graphic things that no one should have to see. And then we just started watching the news, and the death toll kept going up. And then we saw one news place say 17 people died, and we thought it was not reputable because everyone else would say 1 student or 5. And then we look, and then all of them are starting to report that 17 people are dead. And so I don't really think it set in until a lot later. For some reason, my school still had classes the next day. We never had class off. But Douglas had, I think, 2 or 3 weeks off because obviously it was an active crime scene. It was a very chaotic day, and I think didn't really like set in until I went back to school. It was on a Wednesday. I went back. I tried to go back that Friday. It didn't go well. So it was just like once I had that experience, I think that's when it really started setting in. I developed PTSD after the shooting, which not everyone did. Like, only one of the girls I was with at the time, I believe, actually developed PTSD afterwards. So I think it was just because I already had pre-existing things I was dealing with and I was just more susceptible to it. But it was definitely a lot worse when I was in middle school. So I did end up switching schools, but even then it was just, I was very on edge and paranoid about everything, and I would have a lot of flashbacks in school as well. So it was very disruptive. And I'm definitely more jumpy with like loud noises and stuff. Like I don't like when like people come up from behind me, or like if I hear loud construction or things like that. But really the only thing that's like a true like trigger for me still is fireworks, which is super common. So I just really don't like New Year's or July 4th. But you know, I think that I'm able to be a normal functioning person now. And I also think that's due to the fact that I'm not in like a traditional middle high school environment anymore. That was probably my biggest trigger, was like being in that type of environment. So now that I'm in college and it's obviously so much different, like I think that's just inherently like less triggering for me. I was sitting in my room and at around 4 something, I was on the phone with someone. And then my friend who goes here calls me. And she never like just calls me out of nowhere. She usually just texts me, but like I was on the phone, so I texted her. I was like, hey, like, what's up? And then she just called me again. And so I was like, oh, that's weird. I was thinking, I mean, even with my PTSD, the first thing I was thinking wasn't like, I was just like, what's going on? Did someone die? Like, and so I answer the phone and she's like, are you in your room? And when she said that, I knew what was happening. And I said, yes, but why? And she like, at first didn't want to tell me. And I was like, Emily, my friend, I was like, you need to tell me. And she told me that she was in a dorm that's kind of closer to where the shooting occurred. And she told me people ran in saying there was a shooter at the engineering building. And I just automatically just went into like survival mode. I mean, to be fair, I think I never felt imminently threatened because I was in my dorm room and I live alone, like I have a single, and my door is always locked. So like I knew, like I didn't feel like my life was in danger. So I think that was something that was very different. There was a lot of misinformation in the beginning. They thought they had someone, they didn't. They thought it was in the sciences library. There was reports that there was a shooter down in the basement of the none of that happened. They detained someone, and then the next morning, like we thought that the person was detained. Next morning I wake up, it wasn't the right person. And then there was a manhunt. And so that was weird because that's not normal for school shootings. And so it was just a different experience. But I didn't, thank God, I didn't see anything on my phone. I didn't hear anything. I heard first responders and the helicopters, but like, I think that first responders definitely used to be a triggering sound for me, but because they're a part of everyday life, it's not something I'm necessarily fazed by anymore. But you know, that was after I found out what happened. And my friend called me. I only got the alert from the school a few minutes after that. So there was definitely like a delay. Obviously we went in lockdown and everything. I was probably up until like 4 a.m. I went to bed not knowing who the shooter was. I woke up, they said they had someone detained. Then I went to my friend's house. Then that night, when I was off campus, they said that they did not have a shooter. So thankfully I was off campus at that point, because then people started getting neurotic and there were false reports of shots and everyone got, so, you know, it's just a lot of like chaos and uncertainty and like, where's the shooter? And that investigation lasted a very long time and way until I was home. So it was a different experience, but thankfully I was in my room. One of the reasons I chose Brown is because I felt safe here, and I think that's still true. You know, obviously like my hypervigilance got worse, but that's really that's in any environment. So it's not just Brown. I think honestly, I probably feel safer here than I would like in public. And I think that's just something I've always felt, because it's like, this is a more isolated place. And I think I know that like this shooting didn't happen because Brown had security flaws. It just happened because we live in America. And so I don't feel like there's necessarily any like security vulnerabilities. Something that people don't realize is like, everyone has a very different reaction to this. Some people are completely fine, and then maybe like a month or even a year or 2 years, or however long later, it really sets in. Some people experience it really intensely and develop PTSD. I think there's not one way that people react to this, and that it can often manifest in ways that a lot of people don't expect, just with how long it can take to really process everything. I usually, when I'm having like a bad day with like just everything, I usually just try to keep myself distracted as much as possible with things that like keep me busy enough that like I can't really like think too deeply, but not too busy that I'm like burning myself out. Whenever I meet someone or talk to someone who's been through this, like something like this recently, I think that the biggest thing is, well, first of all, if they're able to, I always encourage people to get into therapy, because that's really what like saved my life and made me the functional person I am today. But also just that not to be hard on yourself. I think there's this expectation of like, I need to be able to function at a certain level, but like going through something like this is not something that humans are meant to endure. And I think that it's really important to give yourself grace and be kind with yourself and what your limits are. And I think that is something that took me a while to learn. And so I hope that that's something that I can tell people before they have to learn it the hard way like I did. The biggest thing is just to be kind to yourself. Seeing someone who's been personally impacted by something makes it more meaningful to you. And I think that by sharing my story, I hope people realize like gun violence isn't just a statistic, it actually impacts real people. It's completely changed my whole life, and I don't want it to have to change anyone else's. And so I hope that when people hear my story, they realize not only is this a real thing that has real consequences, but it also affects people in ways that you don't even realize. And also that it is so pervasive in this country that you can go through it more than once.